Hello, everyone, and welcome to our last Palooza session of the day. This is our CME 101 session sponsored by Integrity CE, moderated by Joe Kim, president of Q Synthesis, and also board member with the Alliance. And I'll let Joe and the rest of the panel can introduce themselves more, but just to give everyone a quick overview, this is meant to be sort of a basics session. And this was directly out of feedback that we got on our surveys. We always get two main comments on our surveys. One, more sessions about grants, and two, some sort of a basics session. So that is what this is geared towards. So we'll be having a session on the history of CME. We'll be having one on accreditation, one on outcomes, one on program funding, and then a little bit about the Alliance as well. But before we get to that, our final reading of the sponsors, our gold sponsors, who we give a big thank you to all of our sponsors, of course. But our gold sponsors are Genentech, ACHL. Our silver sponsors, ASIM, Ethos CE, Forefront Collaborative, Integrity Continuing Education, Medscape Education, Peer Audience. Our bronze sponsors, I just noticed, I thought Scott did these alphabetically, but maybe he did. Bronze sponsors, Answers in CME, Antidote Education Company, Catamount Medical Education, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, CME Outfitters, Creative Educational Concepts, Evolve Medical Education, and Global Education Group. Our second slide, Helio Education Lab, Impact Education, Infograph Ed, Paradigm, Postgraduate Institute for Medicine, PrimeEd, Primary Care Network, RedMed Ed, RMEI, and Vindico Medical Education. As always, there are three ways that you can ask our panel questions. You can click on the Google Slides link that's found on the live page right above the video. I'm Derek, so make sure you click on the link beside my name. You can use our CME Palooza text line to send in a question, 267-666-0CME. And you can tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. I'll be monitoring all of those different methods, so whichever one you're most comfortable with is fine. We've been getting a good amount of questions throughout the day, so hopefully, end of the day, we still have some viewers who have some questions, so please feel free to send them in. And lastly, our speaker disclosure slide. Just keep in mind that all opinions, discussions, and or conclusions expressed are our own, and they do not represent an endorsement by or a position of our employer, its parent company, or affiliates. And with that, I'm going to turn things over to Joe.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Derek. It's a pleasure being here. And as Derek mentioned, my name is Joe Kim. I'm president of Q Synthesis, and also I sit on the board of the Alliance. And, you know, as Derek and I talked about this session and thought of ways of really introducing this concept of CME 101 to all of you, I'm really thankful that everyone on this panel was able to join. So I'm going to actually have each panelists introduce themselves briefly. So we'll start with Brian McGowan, and then we'll go down the list. And then after everyone gives their brief intro, then I'll just have a few remarks, and then we'll go with the first topic. So Brian, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Thank you, Joe. So my name is Brian McGowan. I'm the Chief Learning Officer for Archimedics, serve on the Almanac editorial board, and in past lives have spent time both as a provider and as a supporter. So hopefully offer some unique perspective to this.
Thanks. And John?
I'm John Junkowitz. I'm the president of the American Academy of CME. We're a not-for-profit educational foundation. In addition to working with the Academy in the past, I've worked with non-accredited medical education companies, and I'm a surveyor for a number of accrediting bodies. So I come with both the perspective of being someone who worked at an accredited and a non-accredited organization.
Thanks, John. How about you, Erin?
Hi, I'm Erin Schwarz. I'm president of Vivacity Consulting. I got into CME about over 20 years ago when they put a big binder on my desk and said, hey, could you fill this application out? So I've been working with compliance, reaccreditation, and helping providers make more impact into their educational programs since then. And I'm excited to talk about this topic with you all today.
Great. And Jacob?
Hi there, I'm Jacob Coverstone. I'm Managing Director of Innovations Education. I'm the immediate past EIC of the Alliance Almanac. My organization is an accredited provider. I've been doing a lot of stuff for the Alliance for a long time. If you've seen the guy with the long hair at the conferences, that's me. So been in CME for, I don't know, 13 years or so, and happy to be on the panel today.
Great, thanks a lot. So we want this to be a very interactive discussion with you. Each panelist has a brief presentation or some topics that they want to speak to. Some will use slides and others won't. But we really want to accept questions from you all as the audience, and we're going to try to get through as many of those as possible. And I think, part of the session and the goal behind this is, if you're new to CME, then how do you get more involved and how do you grow your career in CME? And I think that's often a big question where there's not necessarily a manual or sort of a step-by-step instruction guide. So I think when you hear from each person, those are topics that we'll certainly get into in our discussion. But why don't we go ahead and dive into the first topic, which is the history of CME, and I'm going to let Brian take it away.
Thank you, Joe. So I am tasked with presenting a 101 history of CME in less than 10 minutes. So let's see if we can do this. So our journey begins 112 years ago when I was just a small kid starting out in CME. In reality, in 1906, the AMA initially recognizing a need for lifelong learning, endorsed a national plan to encourage medical societies to offer weekly programs. You can imagine this is the first foray into, in essence, expecting lifelong physicians who are trained as adult learners, but also trained as kind of the captains of the hospital at the time, to endure these educational activities as they saw it. And in 1906, this largely failed. We fast forward 4 years later, you can imagine an environment in which a broad report is published called the Flexner Report. This is seen as the beginning of modern medical education, helping to redefine both undergraduate and graduate medical education, and in many ways lays out a roadmap for what became the future of medical education, especially in the graduate and postgraduate phases of training. We fast forward a few more years, we're in 1927, and the University of Michigan establishes the first formal postgraduate or continuing medical education program. This is the start of what we all know as kind of a provider organization within a hospital or healthcare system, specifically serving the needs of those clinicians within that system. Then on the tail of the Depression in 1932, AAMC declares that CME is synonymous with good medical practice, in essence, sticking a flag in the ground, explaining that, in their belief, clinicians need to continue training well after their well after their degree programs have ended. 3 years later, in 1935, we get the first study that has demonstrated that there's a beneficial effect to medical education on small town or rural clinicians. And our first fun fact of the day is that in 1938, seeing eye dogs came into use. Now, to be clear, these are not seeing eye dogs, these are my dogs. But as I do with almost every CME Palooza talk, I have to show a picture of my dogs. And so now here we are in 1940, in the midst of World War I, Commission of GME declares that medical schools have failed to adequately motivate physicians to continue professional development. And you can feel, hopefully, the walls starting to close in on the medical profession. And as often happens when the walls start to close in, we're going to hear increasing pushback by the medical profession over the next few decades. And certainly when the American Academy of General Practice, or now the AAFP, became the first organization to require physicians to participate in CME activities. But 5 years later, or 7 years later, 8 years later, if I do my math, the AMA releases a study that finds that 1/3 of all physicians participated in 0 hours of continuing education in the prior 5 years. And in response, the AMA recommends a national council to establish CME standards. Suggestions include accreditation of providers, mandatory participation, and the necessity of recertification. These are ideas and concepts that we'll see continue to evolve over the next 60 years. In 1961, the AMA, along with the AAMC and some specialty societies, attempt to establish a university without walls, leveraging film and television as the innovation of the day. They believed that they could centralize all of postgraduate training into one national, if you will, university. But this program largely failed to engage participants. Again, the community is pushing back. Fast forward 4 years, and the Oregon Medical Association becomes the first state-based license program to announce requirements, and the walls close in even more. The good news is, in 1966, Batman, starring Adam West, debuts, and as we know, there's only one sidekick in all of CME Palooza, and rumor has it that the idea of Scott being the sidekick for CME Palooza started right here in 1966.
No comment.
I believe that's the case. In 1967, government-sponsored regional medical programs were launched. Again, this is the attempt of the government now to step in to lifelong learning. However, 6 years later, when this program was shuttered, it was considered to be the last meaningful attempt to centralize continuing medical education. We fast forward a year later, and partially in response to the government attempting to take over continuing medical education, the American Medical Association, the organization of physicians, for physicians, by physicians, establishes the Physicians Recognition Award and the credit system as a means of, in their eyes, finally improving the quality of medical education. And the next year, the American Board of Family Medicine was approved, and in its charter required 150 hours of CME every 3 years and passing a secure examination every 7 years, thus formally acknowledging that clinician competence has a shelf life. In 1974, the Alliance for CME was conceived as an invitation-only meeting by Lou Miller. He's seeing an opportunity with the government closing in and with the AMA pushing back. Lou thought that he could actually coordinate across multiple different stakeholders to build a community for educators to advance continuing education. And interestingly enough, in 1975, JAWS was released. And so I think that's important. I don't know about the product placement strategy that CME Palooza was using in 1975. It seems a little bit out of the norm, but I can't question the guys. They've been successful so far. And in 1976, the AAFP chapters launched a computer-based system. And who in continuing medical education doesn't love our computer-based systems? By 1977, the LCCME, which was comprised of representatives of the AMA, AAMC, ABMS, and Council for Medical Specialty Societies and others, became the group to formally accredit CME. And then a year later, the Alliance for CME was born formally. So from 1974 to 1978, it was an invitation-only meeting. And in 1978, the Alliance was formally organized, and the first Alliance meeting was held. That may or may not have been the birthday cake. In 1981, the ACCME was founded to oversee accreditation institutions that provide CME. And in the charter of the ACCME is to set the standards that ensure CME is effective. It was free from commercial bias, and it was designed to promote healthcare improvement. And nearly 9 years later, maintenance of certification has become the norm back in 1990 for medical specialty boards. So we can see these various pressures being applied to the medical profession pushing back, and then the regulatory agencies starting to gain a foothold and organizing continuing medical education in much in the way that we understand it to be now. In 1991, the internet was made available, and there were 1 million computers on the net. And for any of us that were in high school in 1991, we are glad that our high school pictures are on Polaroid. In 1992, the AMA resurrects the 1961 idea of centralized CME. But here we are 31 years later, and politics and professional hostility lead to the effort being abandoned. Also in 1994, remember we're dating back to 1980 or 1981 for the ACCME. In 1994, the ACCME adopts the standards for commercial support as a reaction to some of the offices of CME getting a little off track with their interactions with the pharmaceutical industry. Also in 1994, Joel Embiid was born, and therefore Derek Warnick's life has purpose. Some of these pictures have been photoshopped. This one in the bottom right we believe to be a legitimate photo. Between 1994 and 2004, the ACCME updates the standards in the wake of increasing or growing criticism of commercial influence in continuing medical education. And in 2007, the Macy Foundation released what is often seen to be a very influential report, which again called for the creation of a national interprofessional CE institution, or another approach to centralized CME. In 2012, the ABMS enacts policies that require maintenance of certification to be continuous, with most boards approving a 10-year cycle, principally driven by high-stakes testing. And if anyone has paid attention to what's going on over the last 5 or 6 years around maintenance of certification, suffice to say there is a rather fierce blowback and lawsuits from the clinician community. Now, that's not to say that they don't agree with continuing education. Many in the community obviously do, but there's still a strongly held faction of clinicians who are pushing back against mandates and requirements, and especially mandates and requirements without evidence. Finally, we find ourselves in 2014. CME Palooza is born, and our community is given an incredible resource for our own professional development. And I was lucky enough on March 20th of 2014 to be the first speaker ever on CME Palooza. So where are we now? 112 years later. Unfortunately, the United States pays more per capita for healthcare expenses. We're #1 in costs, and we're #7 in quality. And in a very recent review, a 2017 review of 59 studies, found that most studies find that healthcare quality decreases as doctors' experience or age increases. And you can see a related figure on the right. So we've moved 112 years into the future. However, due to the pushback, due to the oil and water approaches that often have conflicted our ability to advance continuing medical education, there's still a lot of work to do. And I think hopefully from the other speakers in this session, we'll get a pretty good sense of how we can move the needle forward. So I will turn it back over to you, Joe.
All right, thanks, Brian. Yeah, that was a great history update. And somewhere in there in the last several years, the Alliance also changed its name from the Alliance for CME to now CEHP. But there's certainly been a lot happening, and I think we'll be able to dive further into some of those details. So without any further delay, let's switch over to John now, who's going to talk about accreditation, paperwork, police, or partners in education.
Thanks, Joe. And I don't have any slides today, so sorry. No CME Palooza product placement shots, but anyway, so when people talk about and say the word accreditation, what do they think of? Well, if they're kind, they might think of awarding CE credit. On the other hand, they might also think lots of paperwork, or they might even think CME police. But my hope is that by the time I'm done here today, some of our new viewers might think of accreditation as an opportunity rather than a burden. So why do some people sometimes think that accreditation is just awarding credit? Well, accreditation and awarding credit is certainly part of that. When we accredit an activity, what we're doing is saying the activity was developed according to a set of criteria set by organizations like the ACCME, the ANCC, the ACP, or another alphabet soup accrediting body. And we have lots of acronyms in CME, so you get to learn those. But the idea is that these groups accredit organizations like mine so that we can award CE credit according to certain criteria. So paperwork, CME is paperwork perception, and accreditation is paperwork. Well, the idea that accreditation is paperwork comes from the fact that CE people, and I include myself in this, we love our forms. And a big reason for that is that forms enable us to standardize documentation. So if your CE department is part of a hospital or a society or an academic medical center, or you're a medical education company, we tend to work with a lot of different groups within and outside our organizations to develop continuing education activities. And when we develop education, we need some way of documenting that we're following the standards that have been set for that particular profession's continuing education credits, no matter what group we're working with. So can you imagine how difficult that would be if I worked with, say, 10 different groups and every one of them had their own way of documenting the CE process? It'd get really crazy, and there'd be a lot of opportunities to missing things and overlooking things. So when CE departments or organizations are being reaccredited by our accrediting bodies, we also need to be able to show independent surveyors from these organizations that we're meeting the accrediting body's requirements. So I'm a surveyor for the ACCME, the Medical Society of New Jersey, and now Joint Accreditation. And when I'm with my co-surveyors, it's great when we hear a CE department describe how they have this process or that process in place to meet the guidelines. But telling us isn't enough. We need to be able to see what you're doing. And that's where all that documentation comes in. And it's our job as surveyors to collect that documentation and then be able to go back to the accrediting body and make a report of what we found regarding that CE program. And that brings me to the perception of CE police. Some people in our industry view accreditation as the no people, or the people who'll slap your hand if you make a mistake and don't follow the rules. And I guess to some extent I can understand why they might think that, because as experts in accreditation, we know the criteria for building and evaluating CE activities better than anyone. And when they're not followed, we are the ones who get to tell you that. And no one likes being told that they're doing something wrong, especially if it means extra work or changing course in something that you had planned out. So back at the beginning, I mentioned partners in education. And what did I mean by that? Well, CE professionals who work in accreditation are in a unique position. It's our responsibility to ensure that when credits offered for an educational activity, that activity meets certain minimum requirements. And since this is CME 101 this session, I'm going to take a few moments and run through some of these requirements on a top-line level. So the first thing we need to ask is, what is the professional practice gap that's been identified? And for those of you who've never heard that phrase, a professional practice gap is the difference between what should be happening in practice and what's actually happening in practice. Then, once you've identified your professional practice gap or gaps, you need to be asking, so what are the educational needs of the learners that underlie those gaps? Is it a knowledge need? Is it a need to develop competence or skills? Is there a need to change learner performance? These are all questions we should be asking and answering during our early part of our development of an activity. And so once we know what the gap is and what the needs are, we need to be asking, well, what are we designing this education to do? To improve competence or skills, to change performance, to improve patient outcomes, some combination of all three. And I just want to point out, you'll notice I didn't mention knowledge here. And a lack of knowledge may very well underlie the gap in practice, but in CE, we need to be shooting higher than that. We need to be looking at our activities for how can we get our learners to be able to do something better, improve their competence or skills or their performance or their patient outcomes. We don't want to just stop at knowledge. So if we've done all these things correctly, I think one of the things that we need to think of it as, we're telling a story. And when you tell a story, it all needs to flow together. So our gap should lead to our needs. Our needs should lead to our goals for the program. And it should all flow together. And as CE professionals, we need to talk with the other planners. And if we don't have a smooth story, we need to be asking why and help create that linkage. So now that we have a framework for an activity, we need to think about what educational format works best. And it's not a case of, well, I know how to use a hammer, so everything goes in with a hammer, whether it's a screw or a nail. And it's the same kind of thing. What are we trying to do? And then what format makes the most sense for that? We also need to be thinking about our activities being developed in the context of something called desirable clinician attributes. And there are a number of organizations that develop core competencies for healthcare professionals. They include like the Institute of Medicine, the Interprofessional Education Collaborative, Center for Advancement of Pharmacy Education, to name a few. And when we're developing our CE activity, we should be developing it with some of these core competencies that these organizations have identified in mind. And then there's the all-important aspect of ensuring an activity is developed independent of commercial interests. Now, some people hear this and think, well, we don't get commercial support, so I guess this doesn't apply to us. However, appropriately managing commercial support is only one aspect of developing CE activities independently. Whether or not you're receiving grant support, whether from the beginning of the process of development through execution and through evaluation, we need to make sure that everything is independent of any type of commercial influence. And one part of that, which we're all familiar with, is collecting disclosures, having them reviewed for conflicts, and then resolving those conflicts if there are any. And then finally, and we'll talk more about or one of the other speakers will talk more about this later, then we need to think about outcomes. But even though I've put it here at the end of the process, it really goes back to the beginning of the process. When you were identifying your gaps and needs and goals, that's when you need to be thinking about outcomes and how you're going to measure whether you impacted clinicians' competence, performance, or patient outcomes. Not something to be thrown in at the end of the program like, okay, we're done, now we need to figure out how we're going to do this. So what I described was a summary of the basics of accreditation. But accreditation is more than just this process. Ideally, accreditors shouldn't be brought into the educational process once you've figured out all these points, and then you fill out their form, you submit it, and you hope that the next thing you hear from them is that the activity is going to be approved for a credit. At their best, accreditors are really partners in your education throughout the process. And you need to remember that as accreditors, we don't work with just one group. Whether it's other internal groups or external groups, we get to see a lot of different education and work with a lot of different groups. And we learn a lot from that and can bring a lot to your program. Again, if we're thought of as something more than just fill out the form, people. And keep in mind that our accrediting bodies keep challenging accreditors to do better. So for example, ACCME recently came out with an updated menu of criteria for accreditation with commendation. And these new criteria are pushing accreditors and non-accrediting partners with them to focus more on things like team-based education and public health priorities, communication skills, and to raise the bar on outcomes. And ACCME isn't alone in this. ANCC has their distinction criteria, joint accreditation, which is accreditation for organizations that focus 25% or more of their activities on the healthcare team. They're also coming out with their own commendation criteria. So as accrediting bodies raise the bar for accreditors, we'll be raising the bar for the groups that we collaborate with. And ultimately, the beneficiaries of this, I believe, are individuals just like you and me who are cared for by the healthcare professionals we educate.
Great, thanks very much, John. And we're going to have some time for question and answer towards the end. So I want to give all the panelists an opportunity to speak. But if you've got questions, make sure that you type them in. We're already getting several, and we'll try to get through as many of those as possible. Let's move on now to Erin, who's going to talk about outcomes.
Great, thank you. Thanks a lot. Well, when Derek asked me to talk about this topic, I said in a reply email, okay, do you want to talk about outcomes related to planning, related to measuring, types of results, compliance, or grants? And he said, yes, that sounds good. So can you move to the next slide, please?
Yep.
So really, it's important to understand the context in which this term outcomes is going to be used. So when I spoke with a few of my friends and colleagues in the field who are somewhat new to the field, And they said, yeah, this term gets thrown around, tossed around all the time, and I don't necessarily know what I'm being asked or where it's coming from. So I tried to frame it into some buckets, and we're going to look at each of these different buckets and how outcomes is used in these different buckets. If you can move to the next slide, thanks. I mean, the first bucket that always comes into my mind is, of course, cupcakes. As we know, making cupcakes like this requires planning, measuring, and careful execution. We really have to set our expectations about whether these cupcakes are going to look like this based on a number of factors, like the experience of the baker and the amount of time spent. Now, for myself, these second cakes would be a more reasonable outcome. I don't bake very much. But now let's talk a little bit about how this translates into the CME world. So the first part, I think, really following up with what John just said, is related to the planning process for your activity. So when you're planning a process, you want to start by thinking about what your overall goals are, what your objectives are, and then also really think hard and long about what your expected outcomes might be for that activity. Just to kind of, again, define a little bit more, goals are the general overall purpose of your program. Objectives are the specific way that you will get to that goal. And the outcomes are the expected results from the program. And I thought I would give you an example from a program I'm working on in general surgery related to colon surgery. So our goal for this activity is to increase the number of patients who receive minimally invasive colectomies. Our objective is that surgeons will improve their patient selection, port placement, and dissection of the splenic flexure. And our expected outcome is that surgeons will increase the number of laparoscopic colectomies that they provide, as opposed to the open colectomies, by 20% in the next 6 months. So as we're designing this program, we're really thinking specifically about what is our benchmark, what is our outcome, how can we measure it, and how do we know if we've met our desired outcome or not. Okay, if you can go to the next slide, please. So this is one of my favorite tables, and it also reflects something that John was talking about, which is the fact that we have to go beyond learning. So this is Moore's level of outcomes. You're going to hear about Moore a lot as you get deeper into your CME career. And go ahead, Derek, click on the button so that, yeah, there we go. Because really, ACCME and all the accreditors are asking us to go beyond the participation and satisfaction level, and even beyond the knowledge level in our educational activities. And this is because really there is a lot of research that shows just learning new facts doesn't do a whole lot. You have to be able to apply new facts to your life. So if we just give a fire hose of knowledge to a physician, then don't tell them, you know, how, or don't work with them to help them understand how does this apply when I see a patient walking in my office, then it doesn't really do a whole lot of good. So the ACCME has indicated that we are expected to develop our activities with an outcome level of competence or higher. Now, this concept does take some time to grasp because it's not really an everyday usage of these words. Like you and I, throughout our daily lives, we measure participation all the time. Like, you know, did all the girls in my carpool show up on time so I could pick them up and bring them home? Satisfaction, you know, did they all say thank you? were they smiling when I dropped them off? And also learning, you know, while we're all very familiar with the learning process, but the term competence and performance and patient health, that isn't something that we consciously measure all the time. So in our medical education programs, we have to do it deliberately. And sometimes when we're working with content planners, we have to draw this out of them a little bit more. They like to tell us what they're going to do, the faculty, and sometimes they forget to think about, well, what is it that you want the learners to do as a result of this program? Okay, if you can go to the next slide, please. Another time that patient outcomes is discussed is, the word outcomes is discussed is using it in the framework of patient outcomes. So I wanted to give you an example of what the ACCME and other organizations mean when they talk about patient outcomes. So here, one of my clients offered a program called Partnership with Patients Hospital Engagement Network. And go ahead and click the net one more time, Derek. So after over 1,200 participants engaged in this education, they were able to measure the number of adverse drug events at the hospitals where these participants were engaged by patients receiving medication. And as you can see, there was a steep decline in the number of adverse drug events experienced after these educational activities. And so they were able to say, because the drug events went down, the adverse drug events went down, patient outcomes improved. So when you're thinking about patient outcomes, you're thinking about them as being something that is impacted by your education and something that is measurable at the patient level. I also love to bring the Carol Havens rule. Carol Havens is a queen of CME, and she always says that if there was an improvement and you had educational program related to that improvement, you should claim the improvement. So be sure you're taking credit where credit is due. Okay, and the next slide, please. Following up on what John said, also I wanted to talk to you about Criterion 11, which is the ACCME's compliance rule related to outcomes. And ACCME does ask us to do two things related to outcomes. So the first thing they ask us to do is to collect data and information about the changes that result from the educational activity. And this they frame in the levels that we talked about with Moore's, either competence, performance, or patient outcomes. And then secondly, they also expect us to aggregate our data and the results of all our activities, or many of our activities from the accreditation period, into an overall program analysis. And sometimes the word outcomes is used related to that as well. The big overall program analysis can be considered your overall program's outcomes. And when you're thinking about Criterion 11, I would also go back to Criterion 3 and 2 as well during the planning process, because if you don't know where you're going, it's very hard to make a plan to get there. And finally, next slide, please. Outcomes is used a lot when you're talking about grants. So if you've been watching any of the previous sessions from CME Palooza, you're probably hearing that term quite a bit. I just wanted to frame it as this. When you're asking for grants, it's really vital to have your plan well defined and to understand the Moore's level that we talked about previously, because lots and lots of grantors use those Moore's levels of outcomes in both the application and then in the request for information. Grantors want to know your plan in advance, and they will request the data that you promise after the activity is completed. They are not going to forget. They are going to want you to provide that. So when you're submitting your outcomes, you want to tell them, did you do what you said you would do? If yes, show it. If no, explain it. And typically that is a great tactic for working with grantors. And possibly Derek and or Brian and or any of the other panelists can inform a little bit more about that. Next slide, please. And so as we wrap up, thinking back to the cupcakes, please make sure that as you're planning your activities, that you are following your plan or a recipe, that you take your time, you go through the process, planning, measuring, thinking about the types of results you're looking for and compliance, if there's anything about grantors, and if you do, I'm sure you'll nail it. Thanks.
Great, thanks very much, Erin. And let's move on now to Jacob, who's going to talk about program funding.
All right, and it's going to take me just a second to get my slides going here. So,
Brian, now's when you can play your ukulele as we wait, like the interlude music. Okay.
It wasn't that long. All right. Well, thank you guys. And we're going to be talking about funding. I think that the agenda specifically said program funding, but my slides are not working. All right, hang on one second here. Bear with me. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Brian, do you want to keep going, Brian?
Please no.
So I'm not really going to talk about program funding, as I would really classify that as overall organizational. I'm going to talk more about activity funding. But I think it's worth addressing, why are we talking about this at all in a CME basics course? And a mentor of mine said this about a decade ago. I think Jill Boyett is still CFO at the American Academy of Ophthalmology, but this applies regardless of your organizational structure. You know, your goals, hopefully, to provide great education, to improve patient lives, but if you can't keep the doors open, you're not going to have the opportunity to do that for very long. And one of the Alliance's national learning competencies, I think it's number 5, is about managing and administering the CEHP office and the operations, and just including that highlights the importance of this skill set for members of our community. So I was actually told we only had about 5 minutes to address each of our topics, and I'm going to be pretty brief here, focusing more on the types of funding and staying really top line. This isn't comprehensive. I'm just trying to get people thinking. Are you looking everywhere you can or should for funding? All right. So these are helpful groups to consider when structuring and planning an event. I think, first of all, registration rates are going to be paramount. You've got to understand your market placement, your cost per person. Each attendee, whether it's virtual or whether it's in person, is going to cost you something, and you need to know what that is. Determine your value, and the value actually for each segment of your audience. You're going to have to adjust and calibrate along the way. You're going to have to find your market niche, but establishing what your registration rates are, if you have them at all. If you're entirely grant funded, well, we've got a section on that part later. But it's an important aspect to consider, and making sure that you get this right is paramount in overall funding. Advertising. Now, most of the elements in this presentation are subject to some kind of regulation. I'm not covering those specifically, but take note with regards to advertising that you need to at least heed the standards for commercial support. Within advertising, there's 2 main buckets, really just exhibits and other. And really within advertising, we're talking about exposure, trading eyes and awareness for funding. That's what it comes down to. Grants aren't that way. You're not exchanging exposure for funds. There's still disclosure, which has to be heeded, but we're talking about funds for mission alignment here. Within grants, the main buckets are going to be commercial interests. There's foundations or philanthropic, like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Also governmental, think NIH, CDC. You can try and set up other partnerships, and these are probably things that are going to be vertically aligned to your organization and what your actual activity is. Commissions on hotels, flights, events before and after the activity. If you're hosting an activity in Atlanta, try and make a deal with Delta for cheaper flights and one that might actually pay you commission. Indirect funds aren't really funds for your activity, but are drawn in because of the activity. Indirect funding is more like fees for related services, usually within your organization. Did you have an annual conference that had greater than average attendance, and your specialty society is now seeing increased rates of membership dues or membership size overall? Do you have the ability to sell your own products, your own textbooks on your exhibit hall floor? Really, it's thinking about leveraging one activity to grow others. Again, I was told we only have 5 minutes for this, so I'm basically done here. Really, it's just understand the true costs of every activity, create new opportunities, learn to negotiate, and calibrate. It's going to be a little bit of back and forth. You're not going to get all these things right at first. You may never get all of them perfect ever, but finding your niche, establishing your value, and really finding a way to keep doing good work overall is what we're talking about. That's it. That's what I got, guys.
Great. Well, thanks, Jacob. Yeah, I think the goal of 5 minutes was really in spirit, and some people took a little longer, and others hopefully it gave us plenty of time for discussion. So now we're going to try to get to some of the questions that are coming in. Part of the reason why I am moderating this session is because of my board position on the Alliance. And I wanted to ask each of you the question of, how has the Alliance helped you grow in your career in CME as it relates to each of the domains that you've covered? So once again, people have mentioned things like the national learning competencies, and each of you have sort of addressed the specific domain. But I'd just like to hear from you, and just keep your answers very brief, 30 to 60 seconds max. But how has the Alliance kind of helped you achieve that? So let's go down the list, and we'll start with Brian again.
Sure. So I tried to recount all the different Alliance meetings I've been to for the last 15 years, but the idea of having that network before there was CME Palooza, before there was CME Chat, when we were first starting, the only way to meet people outside of my organization and broaden my perspective was at the Alliance meeting. And I identified in my first year or two, 3 or 4 mentors. And over the last 12 or 15 years, I've picked up 3 or 4 mentees each year. So it's just a great way to connect. The interpersonal stuff is certainly the greatest value I've derived.
Sure, great, thanks. And John, how about you?
Yeah, I would just add to what Brian said. I mean, we function in our own little worlds, but even in a big organization, you still get used to doing things your way. And the Alliance gives you the opportunity, when you go to the live activities and the live events, to talk to other people and realize that, there isn't just one way to do this, and maybe I don't have the right way to do everything. And I think that for me has been the biggest thing, especially, early on when, all I knew was what I had, what the organization I worked for showed me. And then the more I interacted with other people through the Alliance, that's really how I, broadened my perspective.
Thanks. Erin, how about you?
Well, with regard to outcomes in particular, a couple years ago, the Alliance had a call for research abstracts, and I took it upon myself to try and basically have a stretch assignment and to conduct a research project on a group that I was working with, and we did present a research project at the Alliance meeting. So that was really a great professional challenge for somebody who doesn't have a PhD background. I've just sort of been working in the field for 20 years. It was really great to be able to get feedback from those researchers who do have formal education in it, and to get that inspiration and to really move my career forward in that regard.
Great. Jacob?
This is kind of an odd one when it comes to the Alliance and the position there. I think for the average person, the 2 best ways that the Alliance can actually help with this are, go to the annual conference or go to any of the activities and understand, at least if you're involved with grant support at all, it's an opportunity to interface with the actual supporting organizations a lot of the times, better understand what they're looking for, and learn to interpret things in their light, essentially. I think there's also a lot of good discussion on the listservs. If you're not a member of one of those communities, definitely sign up. I think personally, the way that at least I was challenged the most when it comes to the Alliance was, I think the year that I was chairing the Alliance annual conference is also the year that we transitioned to Smith-Buckland, and I ended up having to actually read the original journal ledger items for the last 2 years and reconstruct a budget for the entire Alliance annual conference and figure out how we were going to make that one a success as the first when we were with Smith-Buckland. And I think actually to this date, still best attended, best outcomes, most financially viable. So hooray. But that's not something that I think the average person will ever have to deal with regards to the Alliance. So go and better understand sources for funding, and get engaged through the listservs with your colleagues. Ask them those questions. I see still constantly, what do you guys charge for your attendance? Or it's a great venue.
Great, thanks a lot. A question for John about accreditation. What do you think is the most common misperception about accreditation to those who are new to CME?
John, you're
John,
muted.
I think you're on mute, so you have to unmute.
Sorry about that. So I guess two come to mind. One is that, and I kind of alluded to this, is that accreditation is just a CME planning form. Accreditation is a lot more than just a planning form, and I think sometimes people think, because that's a concrete thing that they see, that they think that's what it is. And I think the other thing is that, there's a lot of science behind what we do. We're not just making a bunch of rules up and saying, okay, everybody's going to follow these rules. There's a lot of adult learning theory behind them. There's a lot of educational theory behind them. So that would be the other thing, is just that, it's not just a bunch of rules that somebody made up and, okay, now we're going to fill out the form and follow these rules.
Great, thanks, John. A question for Jacob has come in, which is, tell us about a time when you got involved with Partnership for Funding. What was the level of support and what was it like to manage?
I'm not sure how to actually interpret that question.
I guess talk about collaboration and funding. Is it usually just one person pursuing the funding, or is it a group?
You'd be doing a CME conference talk. You might partner, for example, with a national fast food brand. You would never want to sell out to a sponsor at all, ever. But if you were, Wendy's is a great choice. No,
Nicely done.
A lot of the times that's actually going to come in the form of, if you have a single venue hotel, for example, and you're able to work a deal for any kind of hotel commission off rooms that are going to be there, for example. Even in situations where you might have attrition kick in, you may still also actually have commission that helps to offset some of that. I'm not going to actually disclose the dollar amounts that are going to become, in these various contracts, but I've partnered with other event companies. A lot of the times, if we're doing a destination meeting, and not really because it's there, but because we have a reason to be there, but we know people like to be out and about regardless. One of the things that helps me to actually get people into the room at the right time is also to work with a local events company and put together an ancillary services. A lot of the times it's going to be your spouse or whatever packet that says, here are these away trips and something that you can do in the city, but have all of those things booked outside of the time when you want people in your classroom, so that you can help to structure your attendees' day to make sure that they're preserved, that they're in your educational space as well. But by virtue of making those referrals, by making those introductions, you may be able to get commission back on each one of those signups. So I always try, through some degree, I guess, of social engineering, to use those things to facilitate the core mission, which is going to be getting the right people into the right room at the right time for the right conversation and hopefully the right outcome. If I can do that and also find a way to make us more viable overall, there's absolutely no downside to that. It takes some creativity, I think, and just looking for, what are people already doing? What do they need to do, for example, just to get there? And that's where sometimes flight discounts come in place. Again, housing is a big one, but look to local event packages and things like that if you're in an interesting city, an interesting venue, an interesting country.
Great. All right, thanks. A question for Aaron about outcome collecting platforms. How do you go about collecting data and analyzing that, summarizing it? Can you just give us a snippet on that?
Oh boy, that's a whole CME Palooza talk in of itself. The easiest platform that I use just constantly is SurveyMonkey. I do ask my attendees to complete post-activity evaluation. But my favorite way to do it is in person, in discussion, and having a moderator or a leader summarize for everybody else what was discussed and asking people, what are you going to actually do as a result of this activity, and having it be almost organic and coming out of the activity. I also have a hospital client that is, she purchased an audience response system, like a clicker system, for less than $5,000. And she's now using that on all of her activities. And so when we went to do her reaccreditation application, we had all this amazing wealth of ARS data that we were able to look at and see trends, that the medicine grand rounds were really impacting people's ability to make clinical decisions, and then a few of the others maybe weren't doing so good, so we needed to retune those. So there's a wide variety, but I think you really want to, again, look at what are you trying to get out of the activity before you even decide about what platform you're going to use to collect that data.
Great, thanks. Question for Brian, make sure you unmute. Great overview on the history of CME. Just give us a 30-second prediction on what you think is the future of CME.
My snarky answer is we'll try to centralize 4 more times in the next 100 years, and we'll keep pushing back. With everything that's going on in healthcare, with the move to quality, with the move away from fee-for-service, the requirements, the expectations to deliver higher and higher quality healthcare are going to necessitate the full support of healthcare teams, the full support not only of training, but also of behavioral and performance support. And it's just going to eventually coalesce to us doing it right. And with not only the learners, the stakeholders, the patients, the supporters, and the professionals who build it all getting on the same page. There's just no other option. So whether that's 3 years from now or 10 years from now, I would say we've got great job security in front of us all.
Thanks. So I want to just once again thank all the panelists. I think this is a great intro session for those who are new to CME. And just to finally sort of, remind everyone about the resource that the Alliance is for everyone. I mean, I think everyone mentioned things like the listserv, the annual meeting, great tools, great ways to get involved. I would encourage everyone who's volunteer with the Alliance, get plugged into a committee or into a working group. And I think some of the best ways to meet people and to find your mentors is by volunteering. And in addition to that, we really hope to see you at meetings like our annual conference. So I want to thank Derek and Scott and the CME Palooza for having this session. And I guess as we get ready to wrap up, I'm going to hand it back to you, Derek.
Oh,
all right. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Brian, Aaron, Jacob, John, for participating. Great session. Let me do a quick reminder to everyone to please take our survey. We'll leave it up tomorrow too, but if you can go onto our live page, there's a link there. This session, a couple of the sessions today were a direct result of feedback we've gotten on this survey. So we do actually read these results. I am also joined by my sidekick, Scott. Nice fleece pullover you got on there. Any last words? Thank you to all the participants. I think that I am not out of turn in saying that this is probably our best attended or most participants that we've had for a CME Palooza Day. Most questions that came in from the audience. Anything you want to add before we close it out?
Yeah. I mean, I think it was, it's always nice when we get people that, not only people watching, but people who are interacting and offering their thoughts. So certainly it's refreshing for both of us to kind of get that input from the community. So thank you everybody for watching our sessions. And I guess we'll see you. We're doing this next year. Is that the plan?
We'll see. Maybe 3 times next year.
Promises.
Yeah, right. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. We'll have the archive up within the next 10-15 minutes, and it'll be available for eternity. Thanks, everyone. We will talk to all of you later.